Wonderful to be here with you all. My name is Guy Wuollet, and I'm an investor at A16Z Crypto. I will start with the fun part, which is to say that nothing I talk about is legal, tax, or investment advice. And if you have an interest, you can read disclosures at a16z.com/disclosures. So with that out of the way, I'm going to tell you a little bit about kind of my personal opinions on why I think decentralized physical infrastructure networks are interesting, how I would define them, and then some of the questions that I tend to think about and care about when we talk to founders. And so first, I would start by defining DePIN projects as any sufficiently decentralized network that uses cryptography and or mechanism designed to ensure a client can request physical services from a set of providers. And then by example, the three categories that I kind of personally think are most interesting are telecom, often called DY or decentralized wireless energy, and then transportation, or you could also call it logistics, micromobility. This may be a little bit of a hot take, especially at an event hosted by Fluence and with a number of cloud projects here. But at least for me, I think we ought to use the term DePIN to refer to physical projects that either require the deployment of hardware or touch a real-world Oracle problem, as opposed to decentralized cloud projects. I'm very interested in the set of decentralized cloud projects, but I think we ought to call them decentralized cloud projects as opposed to DePIN projects. And I think sometimes DePIN can now be used to mean colloquially, I make a token and I give it to people to do something, which at some point loses a lot of the semantic value. So at least for the purpose of this presentation, I'm going to talk about things that I think are inherently physical and either require deploying new hardware or interacting in physical space and translating that interaction on-chain. I think decentralized wireless and telecom is interesting because of kind of this broad shift in telecom companies, at least in the US. Energy is the first sector I personally have talked to people who are building in the space, don't understand anything about crypto, and they kind of laud the virtues of decentralization for its own sake. Which is very rare. I think if you've been working in crypto for a long time, decentralization is near and dear to our hearts, but a lot of other people don't necessarily care. So hearing something like, I am generally interested in the idea of decentralization is always compelling for me personally. And then lastly, I think a lot of the Web 2 gig economy startups could be better run, owned and operated as a collective. And this is things like ride sharing or food delivery. And so the first question maybe to ask yourself is, why should you care about DePIN? We have this wonderful event here today, which is a lot busier than the DePIN events were a couple of years ago, and certainly busier than before we had the term. But at least for me personally, I care about these physical infrastructure projects because I think they provide the largest upgrade over existing solutions. Oftentimes when we talk about decentralizing finance or decentralizing Web 2 infrastructure, we're talking about upgrading over products that are already pretty good, especially if you live in the West. In many emerging countries, there are significant upgrades, but at least in the West, we have pretty good products. But for the most part, if you're upgrading from an incumbent monopoly, like an energy grid or like a telecom company, you are not just going from Web 2 to Web 3, you're going from 1995 to 2024. And that to me is quite compelling. Second, DePIN projects really comprise what I think of as being the largest potential for consumer crypto. I think occasionally there's this false dichotomy between the idea of infrastructure and apps. It's a very hot topic to debate on crypto Twitter. And at least to me, we ought not have this dichotomy or this difference. And so a lot of DePIN projects are building not only core infrastructure, but the application on top of it. And it's really simple for me to describe something like a decentralized Verizon or decentralized energy grid to a person who knows nothing about crypto, and they immediately understand why this might be valuable and interesting. And then third, I think DePIN projects are much more likely to touch our everyday lives in ways that a lot of other crypto projects will not, and it will be much more apparent to users. So if modern life is very dependent on the internet, on financial services, on electricity, on internet connectivity, well, I feel like we're only addressing a couple of those things with the existing set of crypto projects, and so DePIN broadens that quite a bit and is what makes me interested personally. So some of the questions that I care most about when thinking about a DePIN project, the first is, why should you decentralize? Because I feel like oftentimes, if you're building in crypto, you take for granted that decentralization is good, but it not necessarily is, especially from a product perspective. And usually the answers for DePIN projects are, to start with, we would like to make it easier to crowdfund or to raise capital, which I think is a perfectly fine reason, but is not particularly interesting or unique for DePIN projects themselves. The second is something more towards the idea of aggregating latent capacity. And this is an idea that Filecoin really pioneered, the idea that we have a little bit of extra space in our hard drive, and if we could aggregate that as a whole, that broader network would be very, very valuable. And you start to see this with things like virtual power plants in the energy grid. Then I think one of the things that has made DeFi very successful is this idea of permissionless innovation, that anyone can contribute to building the core infrastructure that runs our daily lives and financial services. And I think that same idea ought to be applied to the very large-scale networks that we all interact with every day. So I very much hope that a developer in their mother's basement has the same access to build the energy grid or the telecom network of the future as today someone working at PG&E or working at Verizon. I think the second common question is, how do you go to market for these sorts of projects? Because you are selling not to people who want to buy something that has the word crypto involved in it, but to normal people who care about the products and services for their own right. And then the third, and I think most difficult technical question, is about how you verify these physical services, because they are more complicated than forming consensus over a state transition function or building a ZK proof. Yeah, so I think like the simplest thing to say here is that most prior blockchains have been able to evolve totally independent of the real world, so to speak. Ethereum was able to build a blockchain and then a financial system that did not necessarily need to touch the traditional world. But if you're trying to build something like a telecom network, if you're trying to touch the energy grid, if you're trying to deliver food or literally transport people in ride sharing, you have to interact with the real world from day one. And oftentimes that means changing the definition of decentralization. And I think there's often a tension between decentralization and integration into the physical world. And the simplest version of this is, do you force people to pay for the service in your native token, or do you allow them to pay in something like USDC or even with a credit card? The second, I think, is how you consider your go-to-market when decentralization is not necessarily a product-level good for the end user. And oftentimes you need to find a reason that decentralization is building a better product experience for the user. And I think the two most common that we see are either aggregating latent capacity or building a developer platform that allows more people to contribute and surfaces other better ideas that would not necessarily have come from large enterprises. One of the big questions here as well, many of the spaces that I've talked about, telecom, energy, transportation, they have regulation that does not exist for financial services or for crypto projects and is totally separate. In some cases this can be a hindrance, but in some cases it can be really enabling. And for example, in the case of something like Helium or with wireless projects, CBRS or Citizens Broadcast Radio Service made free and available part of Spectrum so that you could pass wireless messages without needing to participate in a Spectrum auction. That's, I think, one simple example. Many countries in the West have a requirement to allow you to sell energy back to the grid, which is definitely an enabling fact for building decentralized or distributed energy. And so I think finding kind of these key points where there is an interest and a willingness to engage on the behalf of the more traditional world is quite important. And then finally, kind of the technical question that is most interesting to me from a mechanism or protocol design standpoint is, how do you verify these physical services? So if you would like a decentralized network to pass packets for you, to provide transit to your phone or provide transit to your physical person, it's already complicated and there's already breakage for something like Uber or DoorDash to ensure that when you call a car, it arrives and it takes you where you're supposed to. This is even harder in the context where you can't trust any of the data or the participants in the network. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. One of the simple network designs that I like to think about is clients requesting services from providers. And if clients are interacting directly with providers, it's very easy to see whether or not the service has been correctly provisioned, because the client can observe it directly. Unfortunately, this does not effectively allow crypto projects to provide a subsidy in the form of a token. Oftentimes, one of the most effective things that you might do with your token is introduce an inflationary reward at the beginning of the network when your network effect is small. And it's quite hard to do that if everyone is transacting peer-to-peer. You see this with decentralized exchange designs. There's a communication complexity problem of some of the original peer-to-peer exchanges, and so many of them moved to a peer-to-pool model. you see this with DePIN projects as well, where clients are not interacting directly with providers, but they're asking the network to pair them with a provider. And now you have the complexity of if the client and the provider disagree on whether the service was correctly provisioned, they have to be able to prove to the network who is right. And because you can't trust either of these parties, you have a decentralized verification problem. The benefit of this is that you then can more effectively introduce token rewards for providers who are contributing services when the network is small and helping bootstrap it. So hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. And if the protocol is client to network as opposed to client to provider, the service provider has to be able to prove, in the case of a fault, who was at fault. And so decentralized verification matters often because you want to enable composability, permissionless innovation, and credible neutrality, just in the same way we have for DeFi projects. And it also allows you to more effectively subsidize early network participation by creating a token reward, effectively solving the cold start problem. Eventually, the network does have to become sustainable, and so you need a verification layer that satisfies the decentralization level of your kind of product and goals. And so oftentimes, the simple solution to this for an early DePIN project is to manufacture their own hardware, have an embedded key in the hardware, and then rely on messages that are signed by whitelisted keys. This obviously does not scale in the long term because you can't have a single party manufacture all devices on the network. So eventually you need kind of a software level abstraction or verification mechanism. For verification in a more traditional context where you're trying to form consensus over compute, there are a bunch of options. You can do consensus, you can create validity proofs, often called ZK proofs as well, or you can use an enclave. Trusted execution environment, which has become much more popular and I think is actually often a good solution for DePIN projects as well. But if you want to take a purely software approach, my personal favorite is a random sampling mechanism. And this has been in different ways used in a number of projects, primarily focused on decentralized cloud or decentralized telecom, like Helium, NIM, Filecoin, and Orchid. And the way this works is essentially you have a pseudo-random beacon that generates requests for service to the network and then sees whether providers are correctly responding to those requests. If the provider does correctly respond to the request, they receive a reward akin to a block reward in something like a proof of work or proof of stake network. And if they don't, they are slashed. And oftentimes, the allocation of requests in a client to provider network is mediated by a proof of stake token. So when the client requests services, the provider will be randomly sampled based on stake weight. And this mechanism, I think, will probably be the best, at least short-term approach for kind of a purely software or crypto-economic approach. Paired with enclaves and in some cases trusted hardware, you end up having pretty good verification for a very hard physical challenge. So some of the kind of open questions in this space, first is how do you randomly generate these measurement requests without anyone knowing about them? Because if you can predict when you're going to be measured, you know, if you know there's a pop quiz on Monday, you can study for it, so to speak. So how you have a pseudo-random beacon that will create these challenges without pre-notifying anyone is a hard cryptographic problem, and if you're working on it, I'd love to talk to you about it afterwards. So hopefully now you have a sense for what I think DePIN ought to mean. It ought to mean physical services and physical networks interacting with the real world. I think there's a lot of interest and compelling people working on decentralized cloud projects, but at least for the purposes of this group, I hope we can start to refer to things like energy, telecom, transportation as DePIN and make it much more clear for people who don't spend time here by calling decentralized cloud projects the simplest possible name. I think you should care because these are the services that, in my opinion, are most likely to touch and interact with the daily lives of normal people in a short time frame. And so, you know, if you've ever had the same experience I have of trying to explain what I do for work to my family at Christmas, this hopefully will arm you with a better explanation, something that's a little bit more intuitive and exciting to someone who maybe doesn't understand what an AMM is. And then some of the hard questions when you're building a DePIN project, I think, are how to verify the service, how to do an effective go-to-market motion in a world where you have to touch the physical world, and then how you navigate some of the more complex regulatory questions when you're touching things that are existential to our everyday lives. So if anyone has any questions, I'd love to take them, and thank you all for listening.
5 minutes for questions. Any questions for Guy? I'll start with one question then for you. Decentralized governance, where does decentralization come in? Does it come in terms of hardware provisioning? Does it come in governance? Does it have to be both?
Yeah, governance is a tricky topic. I think the simple answer for DePIN projects is that in cases where there isn't a good technical solution, or the technical solution creates a lot of overhead that would make the commercial aspects of the project lack viability, you can often simply kind of whitelist through governance a provider. So the simplest version of this is there are a lot of DePIN projects that want to crowdsource a data set. There are a number of projects that are creating physical maps of the world and then selling access to that. It's very hard to store and then provide low latency access control to those sorts of data sets. And so a number of projects basically, through governance, elect someone to run an AWS server or something similar, and then work on behalf of the DAO and on behalf of the protocol. So that's one example where I think governance can help to solve some of the complicated problems. But for the most part, in my opinion, if you can minimize governance, you probably ought to, because it's quite difficult to incentivize participation. And then I think humans are more fallible than code. So a lot of what we ought to focus on, I think, is translating some of those difficult questions into autonomous systems.
Any other questions? Yes.
Hello. Oh, sorry.
Huge.
Hey, Sylvan, co-founder of Parasail. So I just have one question. Do you think that permissionless provider participation is necessary or a must for DePIN projects or DePIN networks?
I mean, it depends on the project. This is kind of an abstract presentation, so it's hard to make any broad generalizations. But I think if you want to build something that anyone has access to, and I think like part of the virtue of crypto is that we create systems that anyone can participate in. I personally think one of the kind of optimistic takes on crypto, one of the benefits is that you assume the sum total of participation and like good ideas in the world is going to be very beneficial. Like if anyone can participate and can propose, you're going to have a better end system. And if you kind of want that benefit of permissionless innovation or of composability, then oftentimes you need to let any provider participate. But it really depends on the application. So I think there's a lot of nuance in that question. And when you decentralize at what pace is more complicated here as well. Because with some things you can build on Ethereum and be decentralized from day one, but it's often lacking the efficiency to compete with a traditional existing solution. So I think that's more of an art than a science.
I have the mic already, sorry. I'm Jonathan from TU Berlin. I have a question. Do you think there is a general purpose DePIN verification solution, or should it be like project specific in any case?
Verification is often deeply coupled with how you distribute an incentive to participate in the network. So most projects couple verification with how they distribute a token to the set of providers in the network. And almost all of these are marketplaces, essentially, where there's very little value to use the marketplace if there's no one providing services in the marketplace. So often, I think it's hard to have a general solution. I would also say you probably want to take advantage of the specifics of the service you're offering. For example, if you're doing food delivery, you can have two people interact with each other physically and share a PIN, which you already do in something like DoorDash or Uber Eats, which makes the verification problem much easier than if you're trying to do something like decentralized energy, where you can't prove computationally, or there's no kind of handshake between two people when I want to buy energy from you in a microgrid, for example. So I think for better or for worse, at least at this stage, there probably isn't a generalized solution. And in part, that's because DePIN is such a broad category. You probably wouldn't say, like, is the technical solution to your telecom company the same as to your energy company? And so, again, maybe the presentation is a little bit abstract, but hopefully it's inspiring people to solve these questions.
Thanks.
All right, I have a couple questions about demand and PMF. It was great to see your talk going deep into it. Number one is, how do you reason about demand sales onboarding process? Meaning, A lot of DePIN networks fail to get demand, supply is easy, and so on. I think one of the key reasons for this is that we have not found a crypto-native equivalent of the decentralized Salesforce that actually works.
Yes,
There's a lot of programs that have tried various things like this, but none of them are actually good. Do you think there's something structurally impossible about this problem, or do you think that there's just not that some people are going to crack, and then once that happens, we'll be able to generate demand similarly to supply?
I definitely don't think it's structurally impossible. Otherwise, I wouldn't be here giving a presentation. I think the simple answer is that it's very hard for anyone to like build a new piece of infrastructure and then get someone else to use it before you've been able to use it yourself, or get someone to sell it before you've been able to sell it yourself. And so a lot of projects, including some of the ones that we've invested in, the original development company focuses less on core protocol development after the project has launched, and then they focus much more on providing an abstraction layer or an interface to the traditional world. So you've seen this in the case of Helium, where Nova Labs now runs a cell phone provider. And if you live in Miami, just like you would go to Verizon.com, you can go and get cell service from them, and you pay in dollars, and it's a very simple experience, but under the hood, you're using their 5G network. So I think oftentimes to kind of bootstrap the usage in one of these networks, you have to take a little bit more of a hands-on approach, which is a kind of a different thought process than if you were building a DeFi project. You wouldn't necessarily build a bank on top of your AMM for go-to-market. So I think we maybe have to have a more pragmatic approach to getting people to interact with these systems for DePIN projects and for more traditional projects than we have in the past for things like L1s or DeFi.
Yeah, and the second is products, especially infrastructure products, have to evolve a lot with time as the use cases change. Many of the projects right now are building things into their protocols that are based on assumptions about how the world works today. Few of them are actually thinking ahead to what the world will look like in the future, and many of them don't have a good way to adapt. So to me, that spells that those projects are going to eventually get replaced by something else, unless we build good adaptive mechanisms to evolve the product. Have you seen any interesting or clever ways to do that, of making sure the network or the people building the product are able to reimagine and rethink the underlying system to be able to adapt to the future?
Yeah, I think this is maybe this is a broader question of, for projects that launch and have good success in many cases, or it's going okay but not great, how do you get people to continue to participate, and what does it look like for kind of the inventor of a project to continue to participate in it over time after the project is properly decentralized? I think that's kind of a question all blockchain projects are grappling with, including Ethereum. So we're here this week for DevCon. I don't know anyone has kind of a perfectly platonically good solution. I think for better or for worse, you probably need people who are idealistic and really want to build something and create a change in the world that is separate from the rational benefit. And so, I personally tend to get along really well with people who are a bit idealistic, and I think there's probably not a way to get around that long term. Most of the projects that we all think of as being kind of foundational to crypto were built because people had free time and were interested and contributed open source code. And so I think we probably need to channel some of that ethos, and hopefully that will continue to be true into the future.
Great. Well, let's give a round of applause to Guy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.